Pericolo da qua, parte Adriano, carica a sinistra, il tiro, e gol, 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 e gol.
He was, for a time, one of the most dominant players on the planet. Not just because of the numbers, but because of the way he intimidated opponents, silenced stadiums, and decided games as if it were inevitable. Strong, explosive, and technically refined, Adriano Imperador was not just another great striker. He was a phenomenon who seemed impossible to stop. In Italy, wearing the shirt of Inter de Milão, he became one of the most feared names in European football, while in Brazil he carried the weight and pride of representing a talented generation, seen as the natural heir to a lineage of legendary players. At his peak, there was a near-universal feeling. Adriano had no limits. His shots were violent, his physical presence overwhelming, and his confidence spilled onto the pitch in a way very few players could replicate. Defenders backed off before contact, goalkeepers hesitated in front of his power, and fans knew that at any moment, something extraordinary could happen. He didn't just play, he imposed himself, and that completely changed the dynamic of a match. But then, slowly and almost quietly, something began to change. And maybe that's exactly what makes this story so hard to understand. That unstoppable player started to disappear in front of the world's eyes. The shine faded, performances lost their impact, and headlines began to talk less about his goals and more about his off-field issues. What once was dominance started turning into doubt, and what felt inevitable stopped being certain. And that's where the question that defines this story begins. How does a player with so much talent at the peak of his career simply lose himself? What happens when someone reaches the top but can no longer stay there? And more importantly, does that process really begin on the field? Or long before that? This is not just a story about football, it's the story of a man who had the world in his hands and slowly watched it slip away. Before becoming one of the most feared names in world football, Adriano was just a boy trying to find his way through the challenges of Rio de Janeiro. Raised in Villa Cruzeiro, a community marked by constant struggles, he grew up in a reality where football wasn't just a dream. It was often one of the only real paths to change his life. From an early age, the ball became his way of expressing himself. On improvised fields, between narrow streets and uneven ground, Adriano already showed something different. Something that didn't go unnoticed. His physical strength stood out immediately, but it was the natural way he understood the game that truly impressed. It didn't look like effort, it looked like instinct. But behind that promising beginning, there was a central figure shaping not just the player, but the man, his father. More than support, he was balance, direction, and emotional grounding. He was the one who encouraged him, but also kept him connected to reality, acting as a point of stability in an often unpredictable environment. When Adriano joined Flamengo's youth academy, it didn't take long for people to realize there was something special about him. He progressed quickly, moving through the ranks with unusual ease, as if he was always one step ahead. Every training session, every match, reinforced the feeling that he wasn't just another talent. He was someone meant for something bigger. And little by little, the dream began to take shape. The boy from the favela was getting closer to professional football, and the promise was turning into reality. But what no one could have predicted at that moment was that the very foundation that made him so strong would one day become an absence impossible to replace. Adriano's move to European football was not just another step in his career. It was the beginning of something that would quickly shift from expectation to undeniable impact. When he arrived at Inter, still very young, there was curiosity but also legitimate doubt. Italian football was known for its tactical discipline, physical intensity, and its ability to expose weaknesses that might go unnoticed elsewhere. The question was inevitable: how far could Adriano really go in that environment? The answer came faster than most expected. After an initial period that helped shape his game, Adriano returned different, more prepared, more aware of his own potential, and above all, more dominant. On the field, his presence didn't go unnoticed. It changed the game. His combination of physical power and refined technique created a rare type of player, capable of shielding the ball under pressure, turning past experienced defenders, and finishing with a power that felt both natural and overwhelming. And then came the goals, a lot of goals. But not just in quantity, in impact. Long-range strikes, unstoppable runs, finishes that seemed to ignore any defensive reaction. With each match, the feeling grew stronger. This was not normal. That's when the nickname emerged, Emperor. And perhaps the most remarkable thing is that it wasn't created, it was recognized. Because Adriano didn't just play well, he dominated. Defenders backed off, goalkeepers braced for impact, and fans watched with a mix of admiration and tension. At the same time, his role in the Brazilian national team reinforced that image even further. In a country known for producing extraordinary talent, Adriano wasn't just a prospect, he was certainty. And that's exactly why what came next is so hard to explain. Because everything suggested, he was only getting started. If there were still any doubts about how far Adriano could go, they practically disappeared during this period. He was no longer just a rising star, nor simply a player in great form. At that moment, he was one of the most dominant strikers in the world. At Inter de Milão, his performances went beyond efficiency and became imposing. Adriano didn't just take part in games, he directly influenced their outcome. Every touch carried intent, every forward movement created tension, and every shot had the potential to decide the match. What stood out the most, however, wasn't just the numbers, but the feeling he created. There was something almost inevitable about his presence on the pitch. When Adriano played, it felt like it was only a matter of time before he made the difference. His combination of strength, technique, and finishing created a level of dominance that was incredibly difficult to contain, even for the most experienced defenses. With the Brazilian national team, the picture was no different. Surrounded by elite talent, he still managed to stand out, not just for his quality but for the responsibility he took in key moments. He was seen as one of the main attacking pillars of a team carrying enormous expectations. And at that point, everything seemed perfectly aligned. The natural expectation was a long career at the top, competing for individual awards, winning titles, and cementing his name among the greatest. He had everything required: talent, physicality, confidence, and global recognition. But it is precisely here that the story begins to shift. Because while the world was watching his peak, something off the pitch was starting to carry a weight that could no longer be ignored. Up until that moment, Adriano's path seemed clear, almost inevitable. On the field, he dominated. Off it, he carried his roots and the constant presence of someone who had always been by his side. But it was exactly at this point that something changed. Not because of football, not because of physical limitations, but because of something deeply personal. The death of his father represented a break that went far beyond a family loss. He lost his main emotional anchor, the person who provided balance in the middle of the pressure that comes with professional football. And from that moment on, something inside him began to shift, quietly, but progressively. Reports from that time suggest the impact was immediate. Still in Europe, far from home, Adriano received the news that would completely alter his emotional state. The confident and dominant player began to give way to someone facing an internal struggle that wasn't always visible from the outside. And that started to show. Football, which once felt natural, began to carry a different weight. The motivation wasn't the same. The joy of playing began to fade, and that unshakable confidence started to waver. Small signs appeared, subtle at first, then increasingly noticeable. Off the pitch, changes in behavior became evident. Difficulty maintaining routine, emotional instability, a gradual distancing from the competitive environment. From the outside, it could have looked like just a phase, but it wasn't. It was the beginning of something much deeper. Adriano wasn't just dealing with a drop in performance, he was dealing with something that football alone couldn't fix. And for the first time, the player who once seemed unstoppable was clearly vulnerable. And that would change everything. What began subtly soon became impossible to ignore. His performances no longer had the same impact. His presence on the pitch felt different, and what once came naturally now seemed to require an effort that didn't always translate into results. The change was clear, and the football world began to react. At Inter, where he had reached his peak, expectations remained high, but his level no longer matched them. Matches in which he would once dominate now passed without the same influence. The dominant striker gave way to an inconsistent player, not because of a lack of ability, but because of the difficulty in maintaining stability. Criticism followed, at first cautious, then more direct. Questions about his physical condition, commitment, and behavior began to grow louder. The image that had been built over years started gradually to wear down. Off the field, the signs intensified. Episodes of indiscipline, absences, struggles to follow the demanding routine required at the highest level. Each new situation reinforced the idea that the issue was not just technical, it was something deeper. His relationship with the club was affected as well. Trust gave way to doubt, and attempts at recovery failed to establish consistency. A cycle that seemed destined to last for years was ending far earlier than expected. And while all this was happening, the distance between the Adriano of his peak and the Adriano of that moment kept growing. The world watched, but didn't fully understand. And even then, one question remained. Was there still a way back? Despite everything that had happened, Adriano's story didn't feel finished just yet. Because even through the decline, one thing remained clear. The talent was still there. And with it came hope, both from himself and from those who still believed in a possible comeback. His return to Flamengo represented more than just a transfer. It was an attempt to reconnect with his roots, with an environment closer to his reality, surrounded by fans who saw him not just as a player, but as someone who represented something deeper. And for a moment, it seemed like it could work. Adriano delivered important performances, scored crucial goals, and showed flashes of the player he once was. The connection with the fans was immediate and emotional, and every good performance fueled the belief that this could be the beginning of a true comeback. But consistency never fully returned. The internal struggle was still there, directly affecting his ability to maintain performance over time. And at the highest level, moments are not enough. Consistency is everything. New opportunities came, new attempts were made, but the pattern remained. There were glimpses of brilliance, but not the sustained level required to rebuild what had been lost. And gradually it became clear that Adriano's biggest challenge was not on the pitch, it was something that talent alone couldn't overcome. As the years passed, Adriano's image on the pitch was replaced by memories, not of an average player, but of someone who, for a period of time, reached a level very few ever achieve. His best moments remained alive, not just as statistics, but as unforgettable experiences for those who witnessed them. At the same time, his career followed a different path than most had expected. There was no grand farewell, no final moment of glory at the top. Instead, there was a gradual, almost silent departure, as if the story was slowly coming to an end. And perhaps that is exactly what makes it so powerful. Because Adriano is not just a story about talent. It is a story about the complexity behind a career at the highest level. It shows that behind every player there are factors beyond the pitch, emotional, personal, human. For many, he could have been one of the greatest in history. The signs were there. But football is not built on potential alone. It is shaped by circumstances that are not always within control. And still, one thing remains unchanged: respect. Because during his time at the top, Adriano did more than enough to leave his mark on a generation, and that doesn't fade. Which is why the question remains: was Adriano a talent who didn't reach everything he could? Or someone who chose a different path than football expected? Maybe there is no single answer. But one thing is certain: the impact he made still remains.